Welcome to the Inner Fire Climbing Podcast. I'm Jesse Firestone, and today I want to talk about rules, specifically the rules of bouldering. Now you may ask, do we have rules in bouldering? Most people would say we do, but the rules are vague. It's generally a rule that we start with the same holds as the first ascensionist. Starting further into the problem would be frowned upon as breaking a core rule. But what about starting at the same height with slightly different handholds than the first ascensionist? What about starting on the same holds, but placing a heel or toe hook from the ground that trivializes the first sequence? What about pulling on with other holds, placing a heel or toe hook, and then reversing to the start holds before continuing? What about if modern ascensionists have all started from a jug that seems more obvious, even though the first ascensionist started on some other hold? There are similar lines of thought with dabbing, the use of knee pads, using noticeably easier beta but taking the same grade, etc., etc. Doing a boulder rarely carries prizes like money or fame, so it might not seem important that we all have the same rules. But the consequences of these minor infractions are not felt at the level of the individual. They're felt at the level of the community. When thousands of people see an influencer dab and occasionally battle everyone in the comments about their dab, those people might get the wrong idea about the purpose of the dab rule. Unlike tennis or baseball, we don't have an umpire following a rule book and exercising discretion. The dab rule exists for self-administration. Our rule book is unspoken, and our discretion is our own. I'm sure I'll get people telling me I'm thinking too hard about this, but in the last 15 years, I've seen a shift in the way the community thinks and talks about rules. Over generations, what's allowed or encouraged in bouldering has drifted as technology has changed. The internet has become the dominant social influence in the sport, which emphasizes reach and engagement as priority values. When mentorship and local community played a larger role, engagement didn't exist, but your reputation did. And if you started a problem wrong or dabbed, that affected your reputation. While I was working on this essay, I had a discussion with a friend. She climbed a boulder and then dropped off from a ledge, not wanting to continue up the Chaussee slab. Some people top this boulder out, some people don't. She herself had done the top out when climbing a different line on the boulder years prior. She asked me, did I climb the boulder? I had no clear answer. We treat climbing something as very binary, and the ubiquitous green checkmark on Instagram reinforces that binary sense. But climbing is incredibly arbitrary. We need clear definitions of what constitutes a boulder and what constitutes ascent in order to have a clear answer to a question like, did a person climb a boulder? But clearly, there's a spectrum of achievement, because there's a spectrum of ethical styles that things can be climbed in. Few people are critical of climbers using video beta to climb things faster. Most people are critical of obvious dabs. Starting or finishing problems differently may be criticized at first, but those new methods can become more popular and visible. And as they do, the criticism fades. So clearly there's a conversation to be had about what constitutes ascent. It is kind of lame to call someone out because it feels like you're taking something away from them. Part of the act of posting our sends or having a logbook is making a claim to an achievement. So I do think my friend sent if she thinks she did. But if I was listing people who had sent that boulder, I would list anyone who had topped it out as having done it, and then add anyone who had dropped off as having done it but dropped off. And I feel the same way about people who do things with or without knee bars, or with modern lines or starts, etc. Because the style of ascent is subject to interpretation, reporting the ascent must always be done with nuance. When it comes to interpreting rules in bouldering, I have 3 suggestions. I'm going to talk about all 3 of them today. My first suggestion is, much like with the rest of life, to just try to be ethically upstanding. These questions of ethics are best answered by each individual. Make an effort to start problems correctly and do them in good style. Once you're on the wall, using the easiest method for you is logical, and to that end, anything goes, as long as you're honest about how hard it is, and I'll talk more about that later. Whether you plan on filming things or posting them at all is irrelevant. I like to ask myself, if I was alone, no camera, no friends, and I never planned on logging this ascent or posting it anywhere, would I be happy with the way I climbed it? I'll admit, for the last bunch of years, I took the stance that a minor dab wasn't a big deal. So you scraped a pad or bumped a tree. Who cares? I became convinced that each individual was trustworthy to exercise their own discretion as to whether or not a dab may have helped them. In my own perspective, formed thanks to mentors and many years of bouldering, The dab rule is, I must be beyond any reasonable doubt that I would have succeeded on the climb if I had not dabbed. Some dabs I've seen on social media lately have made me realize that I was wrong. Many people either do not share this perspective of the dab rule, or they can't be trusted to exercise good discretion in judging dabs. Because if they did, or they could, they would never have claimed what are obviously dubious sins. Furthermore, in many cases, these people are defensive when confronted, claiming that the dab didn't matter, or even claiming that the dab didn't happen. This is a type of argument that I've really never seen in person. And of course it's nonsense. Because if the person is so confident that the problem was trivial for them and the dab didn't matter, then there should be nothing preventing them from simply repeating the problem without dabbing. It's either easy for you and you can repeat it, or it's hard for you and you can't prove that the dab didn't help. Unless the goal, of course, is simply to generate outrage for the algorithm. Virtually all the dabs I've seen in person fall into one of two categories. Everyone present agrees the send was valid and encourages the climber to consider their send valid, or there's a seed of doubt presented by the group or often by the climber themselves, and everyone immediately shifts to encouraging the climber that they're capable of doing it again in better style. Either way, the vibe remains positive, constructive, and socially cohesive. Now, critics may cry, but bouldering is just for fun. And when we climb outside, most of us aren't winning anything or making a salary. And that's true. As far as tangible rewards, I agree. Bouldering is a hobby and a recreational sport. So why do we care? We care because of one of the most important unspoken concepts in society: status. Status is something we all thrive on every day, acknowledged or not. And the most compelling reason for our unspoken rules in bouldering is the preservation of a sense of fairness with the way we acquire and maintain status. If one person can have the perceived status of climbing a problem with less effort than someone else, that provokes for many of us a profound feeling of unfairness. This gets tricky, because there are also components of unfairness in climbing of which we are not in direct control. For instance, a person who can keep their feet on a good, low foothold may be able to gain the perceived status of climbing a problem with less effort than a person who is shorter and has to use a harder sequence. The difference is that, in this case, both climbers, as far as we know, are following the same set of rules and remaining ethically upstanding in their interpretation of those rules. So to me, these are different cases. We can, of course, hope that the climber who dabs chooses to be ethically upstanding and repeat the problem. If they don't, that brings me to my second suggestion. From the viewpoint of the community, we can choose whether or not to grant status to people who infringe on the rules. I'm not calling for wantonly commenting dab in all caps on people's posts. That's obviously distasteful. And as discussed earlier, like with many things on the internet, that sort of antagonistic comment tends to just make people dig their heels in. No, I'm afraid that online community policing is not a great option. What we need is a return of the polite ribbing that accompanies questionable rule following in person. And this is a delicate matter. Calling out a stranger is rude and carries the potential for negative social consequences. So here's my suggestion. Only get involved if it's a friend or someone you're comfortable with. Simply ask them directly if they know they dabbed. Ask them if they think the dab helped. Ask them what they think about their ascent. And always frame the discussion from the perspective that they're capable of doing the problem in better style. Because they are. If it's someone you don't know, only voice your opinion if you're asked about it. Never assert information about starts or lines unless you're 100% confident. Always be clear when what you're stating is your opinion. The goal is not to mess with someone else's experience. The goal is to help improve their experience and to nudge the community as a whole towards integrity. If someone never plans to post or log an ascent, or genuinely doesn't care about following the rules, then there isn't much that can be done. But those of us who do care about the rules must be self-policing, or we risk further erosion of the integrity that holds bouldering together. Dabs are just one example of the slow entropy of our ethics. For another case, take start positions. With start positions, you'll frequently see appeals to authority, such as the guidebook says to start like so, or the FA says they started like this, and these may carry some merit. I do believe that bouldering is open to interpretation, so we should be clear in these cases. When it comes to the status associated with climbing specific problems, it only matters if the individual cares about completing the problem as originally envisioned by someone else. Some people simply don't care and wish to climb the rock however they want, and that's fine. As long as the person is not attempting to gain the status associated with a precise problem. If I find myself disagreeing with the way a problem is, quote, supposed to start, I will happily climb it the way it makes sense to me. But if I post that ascent somewhere, I do my best to note the difference in my start position for clarity and because I'm not trying to get status that I don't think I deserve. By the way, this is one of my favorite things about first ascents. There's simply no concern for making sure that your interpretation of the problem lines up perfectly with someone else's. You just interpret the way it makes sense to you, and hopefully the line is good enough that your interpretation stands the test of time. I have an interesting case study here. About 13 years ago, I established a problem in Portland called the Sensei. It's a link-up of two pre-existing problems. At the time, I started the link-up the same way that the guidebook described starting the problem that you're climbing in from. And I have the guidebook right here. Naughty Karate. Bring all your tricks for this one. Begin with a right-hand side pull and a cool left-hand pinch. Climb out the steep roof, match the lip and tooth hold, and launch to the slopey ledge up and right. Finish on the lip traverse. At some point, future ascensionists of the Sensei realized they could start with their hands flipped, with the right hand on the cool pinch and the left hand undercleaning the side pull. This lets you functionally skip the first sequence of hand and foot moves. Now, I've never brought this up with those climbers, for a few reasons. First off, I didn't know the climbers who were doing this. Later, when it was climbers I knew, I realized I was reticent to criticize them. It's still a very difficult problem, and that should still confer status, even if they start a little differently than me. The guidebook is out of print, and many climbers these days are reliant on video beta to know how to start problems, which is itself a separate issue since not all video beta is reliable. I doubt most modern suitors of the Sensei or Naughty Karate even know that the problems originally started differently. Finally, there's no clear agreement in our community on whether start holds can be assigned directly to particular hands, or whether you just have two holds and you can start however you want. There are a huge array of problems with start holds. If it's a jug you match on, the simplest case, what parts of the jug are you allowed to hold? Can you constrict your pinky in the corner? Can you start with your hands crossed? Can you start underclinging the jug with your feet above your head? We all have intuitions about these questions. We must rely on some individual discretion to determine what constitutes good rule following. I've been to the Sensei boulder several times, and I've looked at the start in person since I originally climbed it all those years ago. Does the start, the way that people do it now, make the problem easier? Well, every single ascent I've seen now does it this way, so it's safe to say yes, it does make it easier. Is it logical this way? Well, also yes. It's the same handholds, but once you pull on, it makes the problem easier to climb. And that's what we're trying to do. Solve the hardest thing we can in the easiest way without breaking the rules. So the hard question is, do these ascents of the Sensei follow the rules? In this case, the rules are vague, so we look to the discretion of the individual, the community, and often for a final judgment, we defer to the discretion of the first ascensionist. Now, I didn't first ascend Naughty Karate, I just first ascended the link-up between Naughty Karate and the other problem. And far be it from me to be the avatar of climbing jurisprudence, but if you climb the Sensei, starting with your hands reversed from how I did, congratulations, you still climbed the Sensei. I confer upon you 11 V points of status. Unless, of course, you dabbed. Do you feel any different with these 11 points? Probably not. More than likely, it just made you start paging through guidebooks looking for V12s. And by the way, there's been some confusion that I was calling myself the Sensei by naming the problem that, but the reference was that The Rock was teaching me lessons, which is ironic given I'm still learning things from it a decade later. What I have to rely on, what we all have to rely on, is that people who use this easier start position are being honest with themselves when they say that the problem is V11. Because if not, the next person who tries it will come away with a misconception about what V11 is. And in that way, small improvements in methods, or small changes in the way the rules are interpreted, affect the entire community over time because they degrade our grading system. This brings me to my third suggestion, and that is to be honest, forthcoming, and polite with subjective grading as it applies to your own climbing. Honest and polite subjective grading solves almost all issues with starts, lines, methods, top-outs, knee pads, no matter which appendage they're attached to, etc. It also solves issues with morphology, predisposition towards certain styles, and emphasizing the politeness part, it lets everyone keep their status intact. It can even grant back status that was seen as having been taken away when done correctly. Subjective personal grading is incredibly powerful. Most of us don't actually care if someone starts a problem differently or dabs. What we care about, at least implicitly, is the status they get from doing it, and whether or not it feels fair. So in a sense, honest and polite subjective grading is a protective mechanism for the individual and for the entire community. The problems with subjective grading all stem from a lack of honesty, a lack of politeness, or a misperception about the reality of grades. Subjective grading, which is dishonest, is obviously unethical. I think we all know people who have downgraded things out of spite or upgraded things in an attempted status grab. And subjective grading, which is impolite, is also unethical. This would be saying things like, if you use the knee bar, it's V5. Subjective grades are necessarily personal, so we'll include language like for me or to me, or somehow otherwise describe the experience that you yourself had. Grading things for other people has always been and will always be a complex and thankless task. Grades often come from a position of perceived authority, such as a guidebook author or a route setter. However, we have no reasonable guarantee that these people are taking equity into consideration. And even if they are, no grade can possibly account for the range of morphologies, predispositions, or potential interpretations of a line. So in this sense, there's no such thing as an objective grade. All grades are an interpolation of a person, a method of climbing something, and a time. Different person, different method, or even the same person with the same method at a different time can all produce different subjective experiences of difficulty. And if you've climbed for long enough and returned to old projects, you've felt this. What we have is the illusion of objectivity, a myth that individuals of authority gain some magical insight into how things feel for other people. This is a consensual hallucination, and the only way to break the spell is to acknowledge the subjectivity of grades. The process of learning how different grades feel and finding your footing on the V-scale or whatever other scale is a fraught one. At the beginning, it's hard to conceive of being polite and honest because we all have to learn where we stand before we can make a somewhat accurate self-judgment. In that sense, we all rely on that hallucination to get started. Flawed as it is, that is the fundamental value of the grade system. The most important step is when you later realize there is no actual objectivity. There is only agreed upon subjectivity and your own interpretation of reality. Knowing this, you can exercise the strength of self to convey that interpretation politely and honestly, knowing that it may impact your status. Personally, as I've gained more experience, I've realized it only gets crazier. Different areas, rock types, first ascensionists, and grading scales all contribute to a creeping disorientation. But again, that's an argument for subjectivity. I'm more sensitive about using personal grades when I'm traveling, and I try to stick to the common grade with classic or merit badge type climbs, because I feel for abstract reasons that there is a historic element that should be maintained. But again, I do that personally and subjectively, not because I believe that those climbs have an objective reality. And I wouldn't begrudge someone for, say, upgrading a historical climb because they had to use a harder sequence due to a factor outside their control. A refrain I find myself returning to over and over with clients is this. If this problem or route was a grade easier or a grade harder, would you still be interested in it? What about 2 grades? Would you still be intimidated by it? Would you still be satisfied that you did it or disappointed that you failed? What if this problem had the same grade, but every other climb in the world was downgraded or upgraded by 1? These thought experiments are quick ways to reveal the obvious subjectivity of the existing scale and how much they corrupt our thought patterns. Polite, honest, subjective grades are the sane path forward. One of my core philosophies in climbing is not to mess with other people's experience. So in a sense, I'm flirting with breaking that rule by making these 3 suggestions. But you may have noticed that this discussion of rules barely included any actual rules. And that's because I don't think we'll ever actually agree, especially on a global scale. When I visited Fontainebleau, I was surprised that the guidebooks there often say to start sitting without a pad, even though that rule sometimes puts the sit-start holds out of reach of climbers with shorter arms or torsos. When I lived in Bend, where climbs are often on tall cliff bands, some boulder problems lacked a consensus start because the old schoolers just started as high as they could reach, like a sport climb. Now I live in Washington, where many of the climbs are features that lack obvious start holds, and much development has been assiduously fixated on selecting start holds for each problem. As you can see, each area, and thus each social group, has its own rules and norms, even though we're all participating in the same game of status on a broader scale. This is why I believe that the best way forward to a better bouldering community is threefold. First, strong ethical self-actualization. Do the correct problem. As defined by your community, do it in good style, and don't attempt to claim status that you haven't earned. Curiosity and creativity with interpretation should be praised, as long as you're being ethically consistent, not chasing status, and you follow suggestion 3. Second, polite and supportive community policing in person. Be clear and firm in your friend group that you all need to follow the rules together. It's okay to discuss and interpret what those rules are. It's okay if the rules change for each problem or each day. It's not okay to be a crass dipshit about it at the crag or on Instagram. Third, the use of polite and honest subjective grades. Work towards a better understanding of the grading scale as it applies to you as an individual, understanding that that will be an evolving and indefinite process. We might not all agree on what the rules are or how to interpret them or how much sending matters or whether status is real in the climbing community. There's a lot, actually, that we might not agree on. But I think we can all agree that social media is doing some weird things to us in climbing and certainly elsewhere. Climbing is just one little niche of life where we can rebel against social media's avarice and rancor. So if you take these suggestions to heart, great. You can share them or this podcast with your friends. And if you like the show, you can support me on Patreon at patreon.com/jfireclimbing. Thanks for listening, and until next time, onward and upward, preferably ethically.